Welcome, gentle reader, to this episode of Everything is Everything by my friend Amit Varma and me. You have always thought of knowledge as the wealth that only grows and grows. As time goes by, we only get more and more knowledge. Knowledge is the ultimate wealth, it is a public good, and things only get better. In this episode today, we're going to scare the bejesus out of you on this. Yes, Amit, tell us more.
Yes, you cannot take knowledge for granted. So a few weeks back, you and I were having a discussion. In fact, the last time we recorded, a friend of mine, Sudhir Sarnobat, who is part of a 4-man WhatsApp group called Food Lovers of Mumbai, shared this message where he shared a post by Tim Urban. And Tim Urban in that posts a thought experiment, which Urban also talks about in a podcast with Lex Fridman. We'll link both of them from the show notes, where Urban basically posts this thought experiment. And the thought experiment is there is a wicked witch who has enormous power, and she decides one day to, play with humankind, as it were. And she makes all material goods disappear. So in terms of what we have with us in material goods, we are back to 200,000 years ago, which means there are 7.3 billion naked people on the planet. And you could argue that there are anyway, they're just putting some clothes on, but they're naked. As Bob Dylan once sang, even the president of the United States must stand naked while taking a bath. So anyway, digression aside. So urban thought experimenters.
There'll be no glasses.
That's true. So no one can
Half
see.
of us will be blind.
Without glasses. Well, half of us, yeah, anyway. So Urban Thought Experiment is a witch does that, and she leaves a note with everyone, and she says, listen, I'm just toying with you. All your material goods are gone, but your knowledge is still in your head, and you can get everything back. All you need to do is build an iPhone 6. Right? Or an iPhone 6s, whatever the latest was at the time this post was written. And the moment you build one which works exactly as a modern iPhone 6s would, then everything is back and voila, things are working. And you have all the knowledge in your head, but all material things have completely vanished. And his question was that how many years would it take humanity to make that particular smartphone, right? And I love the way he arrived at it in the Fridman podcast, because first he spoke about how no human being knows how to make a pencil, which Fridman expressed surprise at, presumably because he hadn't read Leonard Reed's great essay, I Pencil. So, gentle reader, if you haven't read that essay, we'll link it from the show notes. I'm showing it there, linking it from the show notes. So please check it out. But the
iPencil and iPhone all in one show.
All in one show. So the funda of iPencil is that it's basically like a first-person account of a pencil, which talks about how it is made, and so many countries are involved, and so many materials are involved, so much knowledge is involved. So no one person can actually make a pencil. So that kind of talks about the miracles of knowledge. And when you think about it, it's miraculous that none of us can do any one thing on our own too well. We cannot, like, self-sufficiency is a myth, but there is this magnificent, complicated, interlinked web of knowledge and people and specialization which miraculously gives us whatever we want. Frederick Bastiat had an essay on how do you feed the city of Paris. No one person can plan the whole thing, but through prices and through the individual actions of people running poultry farms and growing all kinds of, whatever you have for breakfast, it all kind of falls into place. And this also reminded me of a thought experiment I've unleashed on you and many of my guests of the Seen and the Unseen, where I will often say, and this is completely different from Urban's experiment, so just look at it on its own terms, that if you reboot civilization, say you have human beings with the hardware that we have, with the operating system of how our genes are hardwired, but nothing else, no apps on that operating system. So it's almost like prehistory. How would X evolve? So, when I spoke to Harshvardhan, I asked him how would banking evolve? How would finance evolve? Where you can imagine that, yes, there would be money, but would there be banks? Would they look like this? Or how would sport evolve? That, yes, I can imagine there would be football because it's fairly primal, round object being kicked around. There's no way there would be cricket. It's a historical accident. And I find that useful to think about. In fact, I'm thinking someday I might even, write a book on it after the other 15 I have planned, to examine this, because this question illustrates what is essential to human nature and the way we, respond in society, and what is accidental. So, there are some things that would definitely evolve again. And there are some things where there is no way they would evolve again, or they're unlikely to evolve again. But that's a separate question. But as far as Urban's question is concerned, that we're all naked, we have all the knowledge in the world, but we don't have any material goods, no factories, no mines, nothing at all. How long would it take to make an iPhone 6s? So, what is your answer?
Never. It's impossible. Meaning, it would take hundreds of years. We would recreate a technological civilization, I have no doubt. But the precise journey to semiconductors and integrated circuits and touch screens, no, we would not recreate that. What I fear would happen is, at first we would all just descend into barbarism, right? It would be a struggle for survival. It would be a post-apocalyptic novel or a post-apocalyptic movie. The book that comes to my mind is The Road by Cormac
I know
McCarthy.
you were going to say that.
Yeah, so that's just, those are the scenes that come to my mind. Humans will be eating each other. Okay, it will be absolutely terrible, because there is no way to feed 7.5 billion people without the glories of the market economy and modern civilization. And it is grounded in objects and laws and institutions and technology and food processing machines and so on. So I don't think we will get back to this in any meaningful way. The which will be long forgotten, everything will be gone. So we'll just descend into complete barbarism. The world population will crash to 10 million. And then out of that, we'll recreate a new scientific and technological civilization. And then it is your thought experiment that if you zero base and start over, what pieces of this reality around us would be there in that hypothetical world?
Yeah, I completely sort of agree with that. And what I think here is that it is not just about the invention of technology, right? In the sense that I think Lex Fridman's instinctive answer assumed that there would be metals available, and he said if you get 1,000 people who know how to make it, they'll manage to make it. At which point, Urban asked him that, what about the materials? What about the metals? What about the mining? What about the knowledge that goes into that? What about the cranes? But I think that a stepping, a sort of a building block of progress is not just technology, but it is also what I would call social technology. Prices being a social technology, for example, of information and incentives being shaped to that. Technically, most people, we know about the rest of the world and what they are going through prices. That is a miraculous form of communication. We had a great episode on 4 Papers That Changed the World. Hayek's paper, The Use of Knowledge in Society, explains that. So, that would take a long time. I think eventually we'd have advanced technology, which is basically equivalent to phones and all that, because communication would evolve. We'd eventually get there, but you would never have an exact iPhone 6s. So if that witch was to have the patience to wait all the while, she'd be like, nahi, isme ye chip nahi hai, wo chip hai, and etc. etc.
I have often played with an associated concept, which I encourage everybody to think about. Gentle readers, you should know that the world is a harsh place. Suppose you're thrown into solitary confinement, what will you do? Okay, suppose you're thrown into solitary confinement with with paper and pen, with notebooks. So, not treated as well as Nehru was by the British, but treated considerably worse. Okay, modern jails are worse than what was there in colonial India. And all you have is paper and pen, no books. Okay, what would you do? What would be an interesting, challenging thing to get into the flow state? Not so easy as to be trivial, and not hard enough to be impossible. And I've always thought I would try to do like a A.N. Whitehead, Bertrand Russell project. I would just try to recreate all the mathematics that I know. Okay, so I know a lot of mathematics, but I am backed by books and I look things up all the time. I don't have it by heart. But with infinite time and paper and pen, I would just start. Here's an axiom, here is an axiom. What can you prove? Can you prove Pythagoras theorem? One by one, can you recreate how much of my beliefs? So absent all books, what I have is mere beliefs. Okay, so all the theorems that I think are true are mere beliefs, and they could be completely faulty. If you don't have a proof, you don't have anything. So sitting in solitary confinement, this strikes me as a great project. What do you think?
It's a great project, and there's actually a book that kind of deals with that. A book, a novella, I don't know what to call it. It's called The Royal Game by a writer called Stefan Zweig, which has a man imprisoned, and now it's being re-released under another name, which I forget. But when I read it as a child in the 1980s, it was called The Royal Game. And it's about this guy who's been imprisoned, and he's in solitary confinement, and he has absolutely nothing. And And he, to pass the time, to somehow stay sane, as it were, starts playing chess with himself. And I don't know if he has a physical chess set or whether he's playing in his head, but he plays and he plays and he plays, and almost like Alpha Zero playing with itself, he iterates and iterates till he gets to a point where he's a brilliant, brilliant player. And then eventually the war ends or whatever, I forget exactly, and he's on a ship. And on that ship is the chess world champion. And they play a match, and he wins the first game. He beats the world champion, and then he, if I remember correctly, he decides never to play again because he fears that he will go mad. He will get into that space at which he was in the cell. And this is a delightful story, but even in the limited context of chess, my argument is just playing with himself, he would never be able to go beyond a certain point. Alpha Zero could do that, the human brain can't. You need the sort of the conversations, like every game with somebody else is a conversation between two people where ideas are facing up against each other. I think you need those conversations. You need ways to sort of by osmosis imbibe patterns of play and so on from
in
others.
my thought experiment, I'm not particularly inventing much. I'd be surprised if I invent much. I'm just recognizing and respecting our shared inheritance of 500 years of mathematics. And I'm just saying to myself, how much of it can I recreate myself? So I know a whole bunch of results. I know how to do many things, but I don't have the first principles proofs because I just run to the books. But when you're alone, it's a great discipline saying, no, you have nothing. Now rebuild the whole damn edifice from scratch.
Brilliant. And that brings us to this current episode where we are not going to tackle Tim Urban's question or even my thought experiment of rebooting civilization. Maybe someday we can do that for different topics at a time. But today we're really going to just talk about something, a subject that you took off on when, I first posed this question to you, where you thought of knowledge lost and knowledge regained. Because contrary to what one might think, like one way of looking at human knowledge comes from Larkin's famous phrase, but in a different context, where in this great poem he writes, "Man hands on misery to man, it deepens like a coastal shelf." And I think of a coastal shelf, deepening like a coastal shelf, not just being a great metaphor for misery, as in that particular case, but also for knowledge. Like, how does knowledge accumulate? That someone puts a sedimentary layer, and then there are more sedimentary layers, and we are all constantly standing on the shoulders of giants, and that's how knowledge accumulates. But it's a faulty metaphor because that is not always how knowledge accumulates. So maybe it's a good metaphor because a lot of the sedimentary layers they get washed away by the ocean of time, right? And so a lot of knowledge is lost. It is not that whatever we knew in the past, we necessarily know it now. We absolutely don't. And there are, a bunch of examples and a bunch of stories we'll talk about in this episode where we will, look at certain things, certain areas where we lost the knowledge. And either we have regained it or we are trying to regain it or we possibly cannot. And that's going to be the theme for this episode, gentle readers. So, Ajay, I know that you are a man of great refinement, and one of the ways in which your refinement expresses itself is in your love for food and herbs and spices and so on. So, I'm not surprised that your first story is indeed to do with culinary joy. So, tell us.
In the history of Rome, they wrote and saved a lot of documents. Okay, so unlike many other civilizations where the attitude of writing was often quite weak, the Romans wrote and wrote and wrote. So we know quite a bit about their lives and what they were doing and what they were thinking. In old Roman documents, you read about their recipes. They wrote down recipes, okay, and you read about their prized ingredients. And they wrote about one herb which is called Silphion. Okay, and I think they were using all parts of the plant. They were using the flowers, they were using the stalk, and it had a resinous gum, and they would use that gum, and that gum had a very potent taste, and so on. And they wax eloquent about it. This is the food of the gods, and so on. And in their records, it used to grow in the region of what is modern Libya, what they would call Carthage and what we would call Libya. And it was a prized substance. It was notoriously difficult to grow in terms of cultivation. So they did not know how to cultivate it. They could not turn it into a crop. And so what you needed to do was go forage for it. That people would go into the wild and find the plant and bring back those materials, and those commanded the highest prices and it was a fabulous thing. People would wax eloquent about it. Okay, and there are many, many recipes that use it. And something happened, and in a couple of 100 years, it was completely lost. And so legend has it that the last one plant was given to Emperor Nero, and after that it was never found again. Again, I've been aware of this story for about 20 years, where it just, you feel the loss, you feel the hurt, that there was something beautiful that we knew and it was lost. And it just feels so sad. It would be lovely to not lose our knowledge. It would be lovely to write things down, to store archives, to keep plant matter and all biological matter in an archive in Greenland, so that someday we can recreate a Tyrannosaurus Rex and so on. We should never lose things. I feel horrible about losing knowledge. So I was always aware of this. And so, for example, I knew about many expeditions that tried to go into Libya and in the remotest mountains try to hunt for this herb. We have drawings, we have descriptions, but no joy. Okay. And then in the last few years, something interesting happened. A Turkish scientist found this growing in remote parts of Greece and Turkey. He found a plant growing in remote parts of Greece and Turkey. Now, in a way, we'll never know, because we have no biological material from the ancients. So there will never be a DNA test, and so we don't know whether we are close. But it sure looks a lot like those drawings. And the scientist has, of course, done some very important things. He has cooked old recipes and fed them to great connoisseurs of food, and they are loudly testifying that this is mind-blowing, that this is absolutely great. And then the few people that are in on this story also know that if you let out this secret prematurely, there will be a great stampede of foragers, and once again it will go extinct. Okay, that some plant specimens will show up on eBay and it will rapidly go extinct. It will just be a tragedy. So step one, they have applied tools of modern science to figure out how to cultivate this in a greenhouse. Okay, so that's a great breakthrough. That's something we can do today that you could not have done in 300 AD. And they've managed to grow it in a greenhouse, and they will gently scale it up and they'll turn it into an exotic herb that will hit markets all over the world. Now, as an Indian, I have a special passion for this. Okay, and I will tell you, gentle reader, why you should set up a Google search for Silpheon. The reason is that in the ancient Roman texts, they wrote about a cheap, crappy, poor man's pungent, harsh product that could be used as a substitute for Silpheon gum, Silpheon resin in recipes. So if you were too cheap to spend money on the resin,
Poor.
if you were too cheap or you chose not to spend, or too poor, then there was a backup plan, and that backup plan was hing. It was asafoetida, it was hing. And that's a family of plants that is ferula something. I think hing is ferula fetida, also called devil's dung. And the plant that this Turkish scientist has found in Turkey and Greece is also ferula something. So this also connects that there is something going on here which may well be correct. Now, hing is like an absolute paradise in Indian cooking. There are 100 amazing applications. So then you're on this ready combinatorial innovation that we can happily use old Roman recipes and make a better tomato soup by using the stalk of the ferula plant. But maybe we can make a better curd rice by using the ferula resin. So I am waiting with bated breath.
And it's a wonder of the great technology that we know as writing that we even know this. In his book Natural History, it was Pliny the Elder who wrote, just one stalk has been found and it has been given to the Emperor Nero, right? And back in the day, it was used as seasoning, it was used as perfume, and this is interesting, dual use. It was used as both an aphrodisiac and a contraceptive. So, you're like completely covered out there. And Hippocrates, he of the Hippocratic Oath fame, once wrote about this. When the gut protrudes and will not remain in its place, scrape the finest and most compact silphium into small pieces and apply as a cataplasm. So you can see why this is of special interest to me.
Okay, Amit, tell us about the Bengali contribution to knowledge lost and gained. Sorry, knowledge gained and lost.
The Bengali contribution to everything is immense. Like, there is a friend of ours came up with the Big Bong theory that everything really started with Big Bongs, as it were. So I want to refer to, like, I first got down this rabbit hole through a piece that you sent me, a piece on BBC by the journalist Zaria Gorvit. She's written many other excellent pieces on similar subjects, so worth checking out. And she starts off by talking about a scandal in 18th century Britain. Now, what was going on? What caused this scandal was a change in fashion. So first, to give you a little context into what is this change in fashion, I shall quote from the Encyclopedia Americana. The end of the 18th century witnessed a single change in the style of women's dress. The gown no longer consisted of true dresses, an under and an outer one. The formal styles which had prevailed throughout the century and brought into use stiff materials such as solid damasks, velvet, satins and silks were replaced by the fashion of the short-waisted, clinging gown made of muslin and soft silk. This empire mode characterized the dress of the first quarter of the 19th century. Right. So there was this new fashion based around this really soft, luxurious sort of muslin, which was diaphanous and almost transparent. And this is not actually, I mean, it came to Europe around that time, but this was known from ancient times. For example, Petronius in Satyricon makes an ironic comment where, he's disapproving of some modern fashion. And he says a bride might as well stand naked instead of, standing in this kind of muslin through which you can see everything. And there's a satire of this in the 18th century also, I think in circa 1801, that there is this piece written, this little satirical thing of a lady who goes to a milliner and says that I want to be, decked up in the latest fashions. What do I do? So he says, madam, it is easy. So she says, okay, tell me. So he says, you got to do what I tell you. So she says, okay. So he says, take off your bonnet, madam. So she takes off her bonnet. Then he says, now take off whatever the next garment is, the tunic. So she takes off the tunic. Then he says, now take off the petticoat. So she takes off the petticoat. Then he says, now take off the corset. So she takes off the corset. And, you and I are old enough to know what a corset is. Actually, not that old. But she takes off the corset and she is standing there in all her original glory. At which point he says that, madam, this is it. In these days, if you want to be well dressed, you have to be well undressed. Right? So this is a satire and a slightly misogynistic, frankly, and, a very male gaze oriented joke about a very male gaze oriented society. Now, what is this Dhaka muslin? Right? This Dhaka muslin was a particular kind of cloth which was created from, like its original plant from which it is created, was found on the banks of the river Meghna, right? In Bengal. And this was found there, but the technology to turn it into this beautiful cloth was complicated. It required deep specialization, right? It required deep specialization that involved 16 villages, and each of the villages did one part of the production process. And that's it. And then when you combine them, you get this cloth. Now, Dhaka muslin is not like regular muslin. Regular muslin, if you look at how many threads it has, per square inch, it will have about 20 to 40 interlocking threads. And it's a beautiful, delicate cloth. Muslin is muslin. Original Dhaka muslin had around 1200, right? So today, 20 to 40, original Dhaka muslin, 1200. So incredibly intricate, work that goes into it, and different stages of specialization where you turn the raw product into something else and something else and something else, and you have weavers and stitchers and all of that. And then there is this beautiful cloth which goes out all across the world and is famous and etc. etc. And at this point, Ajay Shah, you might well ask that where is this Dhaka muslin? I want to gift some to Susan and etc. etc. Aren't you going to ask that?
Of course.
You are going to ask that. Now, the tragedy is that it no longer exists, right? So it kind of vanished from the earth. And when people tried to recreate it, they couldn't. They could not find the plant. And the 16 villages that kind of specialized, obviously that knowledge is lost in a generation. And, they go on to do other things and the knowledge is completely lost. There is no Pliny the Elder to write down all the processes. And therefore, that's kind of where we were until recently. So until recently, what happened is that now there is a movement to kind of bring it back, and it begins with modern science. A couple of episodes ago, you spoke of Gregor Mendel, and it is with Gregor Mendel that the story takes its next step, where these researchers found a 19th century leaf of this plant somewhere from which the Dhaka muslin was made, and they did a DNA analysis and they figured down the breakdown, and they said, let us look for something similar. Then they used satellite imagery on the banks of the river Meghna, and using that satellite imagery, they managed to identify candidate spots where something like this may grow, and they found a plant which shared 70% of the DNA of the original, which means it was sort of a descendant. They haven't found the original, but it's 70% of it is there. And then they decided this great project, decided that we are going to recreate Dhaka muslin. So how do we do it? We take this and we try to reverse engineer what the process may have been. And they went to weavers all across Bangladesh, well-known weavers who make regular muslin, and they said, "Ki boss, eta korbe?" And the weaver said, "Amra kichoi korte pari, bolo, amra korbo." In other words, we can do anything, right? And I'm Bengali, so I'm not making fun of Bengalis. I'm Bengali. I'm allowed to do this. And so the person says, "Thik ache, eta banate hobe." And then he says, "This is a thread count, 1200 threads." And the weavers are just like, এটা তো বাড়াবাড়ি কি বলছিস বাছা গেরাড়া here আমাকে মাছ দাও, because they're used to doing 20 to 40 threads per square inch, which if you think about it, incredibly intricate work already. 1200 is wild. So eventually, out of this whole bunch of weavers, and we'll link to stories that detail all this, they find one weaver who agrees. So they put him up in a temperature controlled environment. So in his hut now he's got AC, whatever it is, temperature controlled environment, because that only there can the process happen. And this is a modern jugaad, because back in the day the 16 villages would not have had air conditioning and all that. But regardless, they create all that for him, and he manages to create a version of Dhaka muslin that has 300 interlocking stitches, and they're going to do more of those. And apparently they've made some dresses with this which have sold at a very high price, thousands of dollars. So they're going to kind of revive this tradition. But 300 to 1200 is a long way. So now you have to decide when you're buying the next dress for Susan, that are you going to compromise on the cross threads per square inch and still spend lots of money, or are you going to wait for the science to get there?
Amit bhai, you have to guide us on shopping in the streets of Calcutta, in the streets of Dhaka, and also for lazy people on e-commerce.
So, I went to Calcutta a few years back. This was, I had quit poker, but there was a sort of an IPL of poker where one of my friends bought a team called Haryana Hawks. And it was not exciting to me because poker, but then I realized it's a new form of poker with entirely new heuristics and all of that. So some intellectual challenge, much like Stephen Zweig's character in the Royal Game trying to figure out chess. So I said, okay, and everybody would play it like it's poker. I said, no, we need to optimize completely differently. It looks similar, but the heuristics you need are completely different. So we went there, and I'm proud to say that Haryana Hawks won. We won it a couple of times. I played for India. We won the Asian Championship. But to cut a long story short, one of those events was in Calcutta. And I, despite being a Bengali, I'm actually what is called Probashi, right? Probashi means that you don't live in your homeland, you live somewhere else. So I have grown up.
It's a Bengali curse word.
It's a Bengali, it's not a cuss word. I mean, there are people who are proud Probashis, but whatever. So I hadn't really been to Calcutta much, right? So I went to Calcutta. I'd been there as a kid. I didn't remember anything. And so I went on the streets and I looked at what the retail scene is. And it felt like I'm in India in 1979. There was somebody with like a physical weighing machine that looked like it was made in 1964, asking for 1 rupee coins for you to check your weight, and etc., etc. And I, did that 3 times, and my weight went down each time because I was losing a 1 rupee coin, which then they're quite heavy. So anyway, so that's where Calcutta retail is right now. But Dhaka muslin, the big bong theory. So Ajay, your turn now.
Stories of this genre. So, gentle reader, watch for records. Okay, how much was written down? So, it is the mad British people who kept samples of the plant in a herbarium in some place in London where you could go do the DNA sequencing. Okay, so the presence of written records, the presence of samples, the presence of finished Dhaka muslin that you could then aspire to reverse engineer. So we have those cloth samples in the Victoria and Albert Museum. It's just that we don't know how to make them. Okay, like that, Here is one story from the United States. There is a class of substances that is called aerogel. Aerogels are the lightest materials known to man. So they have super light. If you're holding 1,000 ml of aerogel, it would weigh like 2 grams or 3 grams or something like that.
Like Dhaka Muslin.
Yeah, they are like Dhaka muslin. Okay, so they are a super light material, and so they have some of the characteristics of a solid. They have some little bit of structural strength, and yet they impose no mass. Okay, and that has its own role in many kinds of engineering design. It turns out that for a certain kind of atomic bomb in the United States, there was a aerogel material that was developed specifically for that purpose, and it is called Fogbank. It's a code name. Okay, so nobody knows the details of what is Fogbank. And the bombs were built 40 years ago, 50 years ago, and there was a certain inventory of Fogbank for use, and the years went by, the usual maintenance schedules, and then some 5 years ago, 10 years ago, there was a maintenance overhaul of the nuclear equipment. Okay, so one of the really scary and weird things about nukes is that they don't keep and keep. They're not going to work indefinitely. So, if you take a bullet or an artillery shell, you just keep it dry and you keep it in inventory and it's going to kind of work forever. Nuclear bombs are fiendishly complex engineering. They contain electrical parts, they contain batteries, they contain all kinds of things. So there is a complex maintenance schedule to keep those things up to date. And it's not a small matter to have a working nuclear bomb. So there are some people who genuinely believe that in the Soviet Union, in Russia, there are no working nuclear bombs anymore, because the richness and the sophistication, the complexity of the maintenance process evaporated when the Soviet Union collapsed, and in the intervening 20 years the knowledge was lost and mistakes have been made in the maintenance schedules, and it is possible that there is not a single working nuclear bomb in Russia today. So this is a reasonable hypothesis. So there was this big overhaul 5-10 years ago of ancient 30-40-year-old weapons. In that, they hit a problem that they had run out of the inventory of Fogbank. So you had to take out the old Fogbank, which may have lost some of its properties, and you had to replace it with new Fogbank inside the nuclear weapon. And they were flat out of inventory. Okay, so they first tried going to documents, to archives, that we must be having the project report and the scientific papers and logs of experiments and all that about how this was done. And the scientists of today tried to use all those materials. No Fogbank. Okay, they were not able to recreate the Fogbank. Then they tried to reach out to all the retired people that they could find and brought them into the room and said, these are your documents. You bloody now deliver. You make Fogbank using your documents. And these old hippies, they tried their magic, but no Fogbank. Okay, so imagine in a context of military production with military levels of bureaucracy and record keeping and writing, if you don't do something for 30-40 years, then there is a whole range of tacit knowledge that gets lost. And at the levels of documentation of the United States DoD, the documentation was inadequate and they could not recreate it. And with great anger and screaming auditors, they spent some $70 million doing a brand new research project to achieve that same aerogel from scratch. But the old knowledge of how you get to Fogbank was lost. Okay, so this is a reminder that under very optimistic conditions of record keeping and even having the old hippies around, you could still not make Fogbank successfully with a gap of 30-40 years. So this is a real salutary tale that this kind of knowledge is precious and we should do all we can to store it and log it. But if you're not actively doing something, it will go away, that the knowledge will be lost.
So I have a similar story, which I got reminded of when you said that they spoke to retired old scientists over there back in the day and all that. So my story is this, that, there is an army camp. And in that army camp, there are conventions and norms and ways of doing things. And one of the conventions is that 24 hours, there will be a guard who will stand beside a bench. right? There is no strategic or tactical significance to anything. There is a random bench in the garden and a guard will stand besides it. And every 8 hours, a shift will change. So a new commandant comes and he says, ki, and he is like you or me. He is not just accepting convention blindly. He is saying, I will ask why. So he asks the guard, why are you standing? He says, I've been told to stand. It's my shift. He asks the deputy commandant. He has no idea. He says, it's always been like this. He speaks to the previous commandant. He says,
Nobody
ki,
remembers.
yeah, nobody remembers. So he keeps going back, the previous commandment to the previous commandant, not commandment, but you could think of it as 10 commandants. But anyway, so eventually he goes back to the guy who founded the camp decades ago, who is now 93 years old and lying in bed and all that. And, he takes a flight out, flying economy class, and figures out where this guy lives and manages to go to that little farm. And his wife says that, he's really ill and I'm not sure this will work, and etc. etc. And he says, no, please, I have to see him. This is important. Now it's not freaking important, but now he's obsessed. He's like you and me. He'll be obsessed with random things. So he's like, I want to see it and all that. And then the wife says, okay, you can go in, but don't alarm him. Don't. He says, no, I just want to ask one question. So he goes in and he goes to the commandment and he says, that bench in the middle of the field at such and such latitude, longitude? And the commandant says, yes. So then he asks him that, tell me something. There's a guard who stands besides it. Why is he standing there? So this 93-year-old guy looks at him with his wizened eyes and says, what are you saying? The paint hasn't dried yet. Right? So this is also why keeping track of old knowledge is important. So Ajay, one more story. This is not enough. We are not satisfied.
This episode is stories that ought to be movies, or it isn't.
These could all be movies,
Each
actually.
of
These are
these-
very interesting quests.
And, there's so much human drama surrounding each of these. Okay, I want to tell a story about a drug, and it is the centerpiece of modern treatments against malaria, and it is called Artemisinin. The story runs that this was an idea in traditional Chinese medicine. So there were ancient texts in China which had all kinds of fanciful claims. Okay, so it's important to not exaggerate the amount of knowledge, what in modern terms would be called the factuality of ancient texts. Ancient texts are cool and funny. They are intended as humor. And they have an occasional nugget of amazing truth in them. And thousands of experiments have been done based on plants and chemicals in ancient texts. And two statements are true. One, that most of that knowledge is rubbish. Two, that some of it is mind-blowingly great. Okay? So I want to tell you one story that is mind-blowingly great. So there was a woman, Yu Tao, who was deputed in 1974 in the time of the Vietnam War to go to Vietnam and help the people of Vietnam. And the people of Vietnam said, the one thing we want help with is malaria. Okay, that was a phase where the plasmodium was developing resistance to quinine. So the old first line attack against malaria was quinine, and by the early 70s, the plasmodium had shapeshifted and mutated and started becoming resistant to quinine. So she saw with her own eyes the physical misery of malaria. For anybody who has had malaria, it is grueling. Okay, most of us are not lucky enough to be Alfred North Wallace and carry something cool out of that journey. It's just horrible. And she was physically moved by what she saw in Vietnam, and she felt a great resolve to try to help. And I also want to say to everybody, because Amit and I are always campaigning about the pure human flame burning in your breast. She was a non-PhD. She was not a credentialed researcher. She was just a person that said, I should think about this.
Hunger for knowledge arising out of empathy for the world.
Yes, there's no better package in the world possible. And she remembered that she had read some claims in ancient Chinese texts about some cures for malaria. And I seem to think that 2,000 plants from traditional Chinese texts had been tested and they had all failed. So like, you should have no illusions about the hit rate, that if you find some ancient Aramaic text, you should not get excited that there is any factuality in it. It's cute and funny. It is intended as humor. It is not intended as knowledge. So she felt that there was something going on there, and she was a master of classical Chinese, and she was able to read the texts better than many other people. And there is something called a wormwood tree, and they talk about using it about malaria. Now, there were papers which had tested the wormwood tree and found that it does not work. She had the knowledge of the language to be able to read sentences carefully, and she felt that she interpreted a sentence saying that you throw pieces of the plant into water, and it was about a handful of the plant in about a liter of water, and you don't heat it. So she thought cold extraction, not hot extraction. Generally, the scientific experiments are always like you put a bunch of tea leaves into boiling water and you get a hot extract. She thought maybe that's a line of attack to try, and she did it. And lo and behold, she first used it on 20 patients and all 20 recovered. Okay, and that was a breakthrough, and that was how an ancient piece of knowledge, Artemisinin, was rediscovered and brought to bear on the modern world. And actually, with modern science, we've done much better than that. Then the scientists understood that there is one particular sequence inside the molecule which has the punch against the Plasmodium falciparum, and then there are derivative molecules from that that are even more powerful, and that is the mainline mosquito treatment, malaria treatment for all of us in this world today. So if you get malaria, you should remember a woman looking at the misery of malaria in Vietnam and doing research with the wormwood tree in China. While I'm on the subject, I also want to link to the role of plants and materials from Mother Nature in terms of how they influence our world. I think in the modern world, we are a little too arrogant in that we think we fabricate everything. Okay, so we make the iPhone. So like that, we think we fabricate everything. I think we tend to understate the amount of knowledge that has come from outside. So the discovery of coffee is because some shepherd in Ethiopia noticed that when his goats would eat the berries of the coffee plant, they would become unusually frisky and jump around and have a good time. Okay, so he thought, oh, there's something going on here. Why don't I chew on this? Okay, and then through hundreds of years and random experiments, they got to roasting. Okay, so that's how we discover these things. Scientists have seen, today we have hard scientific evidence about a gorilla gets a stomach upset. The gorilla walks 15 kilometers, finds one particular plant and eats it. Okay, and aborigines are able to observe the animals and get this kind of knowledge. In his great book, you guys are sick of us only talking about a few books. In his great book, Seeing Like a State, James C. Scott emphasizes that out of the top 20 most important drugs of the world, half of them have plant origins and origins of knowledge of traditional people. So they have come from old wives' tales, and these include quinine. Quinine came from aborigines in South America. Artemisinin, which came from the story that I just told. Metformin is a flower in Europe, okay, and so on. So about half of the most important 20 drugs of modern mankind are actually knowledge of the ancients that has of course been refined, industrialized, made predictable. I don't want to understate that, you know, if I gave you a flower pot where the metformin flower was growing, the flower would bloom sometimes, it would not be there sometimes, and you don't know about dosage, how ripe is the flower, how spoiled is the flower. I mean, there is a whole lot of uncertainty. There are great feats of modern science in delivering a 500 mg slow release metformin. I don't want to knock that. And of course the role of the testing, because as I said, 2000 different materials mentioned in traditional Chinese medicine were tested for malaria and they were all found useless. So I don't want to overstate the idea that there is high factuality in ancient texts, but we should not underestimate the wonders that are out there with traditional people. And it is really tragic how the knowledge of the forest in the hands of the aborigines is rapidly vanishing, and you know, we should do all we can to protect that knowledge.
So I want to make what I think is an important point about tradition and science, where when it comes to tradition, I feel that we should be deeply skeptical of it, but never dismissive, right? Because a lot of what works in the world, we find out through trial and error. Millions of people over history and prehistory have millions of different herbs and millions of different things happen, and then, something happens to work and they may not know why. They don't have the germ theory, they don't understand DNA, but they figure out that, oh, if we do this at this time, it happens to work and it becomes a tradition. And therefore, a lot of the wisdom, as you pointed out in these cases, have come from there. However, it's also important to note that this is basically survivor bias if you only focus on these. The 2000 plants that did not pass the test are also important. I think what happens is our traditional knowledge systems also got ossified, and they also had scientific theory built around it, around certain first principles, which came from a complete lack of knowledge of what science today tells us. So all the first principles of all these ancient knowledge systems are actually bunkum. So if you start extending them in other directions, you don't really get anywhere. And what typically happens is, let us say that there is a tradition that I am not feeling well, I have a stomach upset, so I take a herb and I have it and the stomach upset goes, and I say, hey, that always works. So I tell my folks and they carry it across, and then people, whenever they have a stomach upset, they have that, and hey, it seems to work. And what's going on here, and this is actually, there are two phenomena at play which play when it comes to all alternative medicine. I won't call them medicine, but all quackery basically. And one of them is just a reversion to the mean, that there are a lot of diseases like a common cold that they revert to the mean. So if I get a cold, if I take medicine, I will get better in X amount of time. If I don't take medicine, I will get better in the same X amount of time. But what happens is that when we assume that ye lene se ye theek hoga, we apply causality, and there is no reason for that causality. So a lot of these traditions continue because there is reversal to the mean, reversion to the mean, and there is also confirmation bias, that I take the herb and my stomach upset gets better, and I'll be like, huh, that caused it. But the times where it continues for a day or two extra, I'll make some other excuse, like a witch cast a spell on me, if this is prehistoric times, etc., etc. And the other factor, obviously, in why things seem to work when they don't is a placebo effect, which is incredibly powerful. During World War II, there are stories that at one point doctors ran out of anesthetic, but they applied something else and they told the patient it's anesthetic, and they literally operated and he didn't feel anything. So the placebo effect is incredibly powerful, which is why when modern double-blind randomized controlled trials are done, they are not medicine versus no medicine. They are medicine versus placebo. For a medicine to pass the test, you have to do better than placebo, not better than nothing. Because placebo also has an effect where you believe that this will help me, and the mind works in mysterious ways. So I'm incredibly skeptical of all knowledge systems of the past. Something like homeopathy, which is complete quackery, became popular in the 19th century at a time where medicine simply wasn't advanced. There was no germ theory. Bloodletting was, the cure for most things. We discussed in our earlier episode about Ignaz Semmelweis that, 10% of the people who went into maternity wards died. Nobody wanted to go there. So an alternative system, which is only sugar pills, and it won't kill you even if it doesn't make you better, obviously kind of takes off. But now with the benefit of science, we know exactly what we know. So, there's a great book called Bad Medicine by Ben Goldacre. We'll link it from the show notes. There's another book called Trick or Treatment by Edzard Erst and Simon Singh, I think. We'll link that from the show notes. I have an episode with Abby Phillips, who's also known as Liver Doctor. We'll link that also from the show notes. So I think when it comes to tradition, we should be super skeptical. If it passes a scientific method, then yeah, sure, believe it, which is exactly what happened in this case that you pointed out. But otherwise, as a caution, never go by it blindly. Respect tradition, but always be skeptical. So, Ajay, I want to begin this chapter by asking you an important question. All right, here's a question. Supposing, if you go back to Tim Urban's original thought experiment, everything, kind of all material goods vanish, humans vanish. Or rather, humans have a post apocalyptic scenario and savages are left and they continue. And then later, 800 years later, those savages, when they can finally read things, or 3000 years later, those savages find that one thing survived from the great apocalypse, and that was an iPhone 6X. And because they have just reinvented electricity, they can actually plug it in and see what's on it. And they look at the SMS messages of the iPhone 6S. How will they refer to those SMS messages? What will they call them?
I don't know.
Ancient texts. But on that note, let's come back to modern times. You are, of course, a great buff of warfare and know more about World War II than any Indian alive. But what happened after World War II is also supremely interesting. Like Tony Judd has a great book on, post-war Europe and the recovery. We'll link it from the show notes, masterpiece. But tell me a little bit about that, because there also it is the same phenomenon. Not only have economies been destroyed, but how do we think of knowledge in those times? It is not just a reconstruction of a society, it is also, in a sense, a reconstruction of knowledge.
So, in the spirit of this episode, let's think about the recovery of Germany and Japan after the Second World War. At the Second World War, they experienced complete destruction of essentially every factory, most buildings, certainly institutions, particularly in Germany. That entire machinery of society was thrown off track. And you would think, how the hell are they ever going to get back on track? So there is a bit of an iPhone and Wicked Witch casting a spell idea that individually the people in Germany had the full brain power of being one of the great advanced technological civilizations of the 20th century. Okay, Adolf Hitler had only come to power in 1933. Prior to 1933, they had knowledge from the glory of the Weimar Republic, one of the great democratic societies of the world. The Weimar Republic knew freedom on a scale that many countries today don't have, that many advanced economies today do not replicate the level of freedom that was known from 1918 to 1933 in Germany. So all those things were there in the minds of the German people. But surrounding them was death and devastation. And also the organizations of society had been completely disrupted, because first they were taken over by the Nazis, and then in the war effort, the Nazi party got destroyed and those institutions got fully damaged. So you'd have thought that this is going to be very difficult, that how will we recreate from this? Similarly in Japan, the firebombing of Tokyo, they had houses made of wood. They basically burned down entire cities. And how are you going to restart from scratch? The factories are gone, and in Japan there was a little greater institutional stability, but the people had all the knowledge, but around it was a physical destruction. It is impossible to think of this period without also noticing that from 1945 to 1948, for 3 years, actually what was happening was a horrible level of ethnic cleansing, where large populations were being moved under force from one country to another. So places like Czechoslovakia and Poland were throwing out their German residents who were refugees coming back to Germany, things like that. So all over these countries, there was a complete nightmare about what had happened, that these went from being great technological civilizations. Okay, always and always we should remember that in 1933, Germany had more Nobel laureates than the UK. Okay, that is how great Germany was at the time. And they were down to zero in the 45 to 48 period. In the light of this episode then, it is actually quite remarkable and near miraculous how they bounced back. So FRG, the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, bounced back. East Germany never quite recovered. And even today, East Germany is poor because they came under communist rule and things didn't work out for them. But in West Germany, they completely bounced back and they rapidly got high GDP growth. Yeah, there was a Marshall Plan, and so money was available. Documents and manuals came from abroad. So it's not the iPhone example. It's that you still have books. Okay, that there were enough books which could be printed abroad and brought back. So even if every copy of Euclid's Elements in Germany had been burned down, you could bring back copies of Euclid's Elements from outside and reinfuse that knowledge into the country. And there was the Marshall Plan. Remarkably enough, many German corporations made it across the war. So imagine, there is a Second World War, there's complete devastation, every factory is gone, and Volkswagen comes back. Okay, but they did. That there were enough people with the minds. And by the way, they hung on to records and they protected the shareholding of pre-war shareholders. That if you had a share in Volkswagen, they rebuilt the company, but they respected the property rights. Said, oh, you're the owner. We'll now start paying you dividends. So they were able to resurrect a great deal of the German institutions and firms. They were able to bring in external capital. They dug out an old Weimar draft of the constitution, introduced a whole bunch of pacifism into it, and it became the new German constitution. And West Germany rose like a phoenix. Okay. Similarly, in Japan, there was a period of American colonial rule, which was a great success. It got the country going again. The country got a fairly modern pacifist constitution, more or less imposed by the Americans. And the country rose like a phoenix. And both countries, they went through their truth and reconciliation phase. They decisively turned their backs on nationalism, militarism, racism, a whole bunch of the ugliness that got us to, the horrible things during the war. And they really thought afresh about their culture and they reinvented themselves. And today they are amongst the great countries of the world. So this is a kind of similar story, and yet there are many good elements. But if I had been standing in 1945, I would have guessed that this is going to be harder. I would not have been able to predict how well West Germany was going to take off and how well Japan was going to take off.
And I love both these stories because today Germany and Japan are both great nations. And when I think of Germany during that period, I think one thing they got right, and maybe they were lucky to get it right, to have the right man in the right place, or maybe it would have happened anyway. Their finance minister between 1949 to 1962, I think, was a guy called Ludwig Erhard. He was Adenauer's finance minister during that time, and he understood the value of freedom. He would have lived through some of the Weimar Republic, and where you said the values of freedom mattered, the respect for property rights. So it is really a flourishing of free markets where you have a strong rule of law, and yet you have freedom and you allow individuals to flourish, and you respect firms and you encourage firms, and all the right things, all the things we would dream of for India actually happened. So you managed to come back from that low base, that massive destruction, and come up to where you are. So I think Erhard is one of the great men of the 20th century for me. And at this point, I'll give a couple of recommendations. One is about Germany, one is about Japan. There's a great book by W.G. Sebald called On the Natural History of Destruction. It is a masterpiece, and it has many pages about what happened in Dresden. And Sebald has this unique style where he will combine photographs, old black and white photographs, with text, and they go together in these beautiful essays. And it's just absolutely remarkable and an inspiration and something for modern creators to think about. Like as I've wanted for the longest time to start a solo vlog, which I will at some time. And I think of that how can I be inspired by people like Sebald and use both text and visuals and now video also in interesting ways to create, moving essays, as it were, moving in multiple ways. So that's a book to check out. And the other book I would recommend is a fine book on Japan called Orienting by Pallavi Iyer. It's a travelogue, but it's just beautiful essay. She's a spectacularly good writer. Did a lovely episode of The Seen and the Unseen with me as well. So I've got my recommendations over with.
And my recommendation for today is a short story by Isaac Asimov that is called Nightfall. And I will not say anything because that would be a spoiler.